Hello there and welcome back to the channel, and for those of you who are new to the channel, welcome to the community. Today I have another Vladimir video for you guys. Ever since the new items were released, there's this big debate going on all over the internet about which build is the best. Is it the Rocketbelt build or the Nightharvester build, and when should you go Nightharvester and when Rocketbelt? I myself have participated many times in this debate and even made videos on it, and in this video I'll finally bring you the one and only correct answer, and I can 100% guarantee you that what I'm about to say is 100% correct because I used the only viable method to come up with an answer, which is analyzing the numbers behind each build and more specifically behind each and every item power spike. Alright, let's get started with the Rocketbelt build. As you should know by now, Rocketbelt has a mythic passive that gives you an extra 5 flat magic penetration per legendary item you buy. And what people tend to forget is that Rocketbelt also gives you 6 flat magic penetration by default, just for completing the item. That's basically all you need to know for now. So let's take a look at the most common Rocketbelt build. That would be Rocketbelt into Cosmic Drive, into Deathcap, into Void Staff, into a situational item, and obviously we can't forget about our boots. Now I put the boots at the end of it because that's going to make it easier to draw some conclusions. Also, runes are not accounted for in the stats, so I'm not including the extra AP you would get from Gathering Storm, for example, in those numbers. Also, we're going to choose the Monarch's Embrace as the situational item for the Rocketbelt and the Nightharvester build because the Monarch's Embrace doesn't give any magic penetration or ability haste, so it's perfect for just drawing some conclusions. Alright, so at full build, this Rocketbelt build would give us about 670 AP, 45 ability haste, 40% magic penetration and 44 flat penetration. Now let's take a look at what the Nightharvester build has to offer. We're going to work with the most common Nightharvester build, which should be this. Nightharvester into Deathcap, into Void Staff, into Shadow Flame, into again a situational item, and obviously we're going to finish up with our boots. Once again, we're going to choose the Monarch's Embrace as our situational item. At full build, this Nightharvester build offers us 723 AP, 45 ability haste, 40% magic penetration, and 28 to 38 flat magic penetration. Keep in mind that the reason why it says 28 to 38 flat magic penetration is because of how Shadow Flame works. Standard Shadow Flame gives you 10 flat magic pen, but depending on the amount of current HP and shielding the enemies have, you can get up to 20 flat magic penetration. And if we add the 18 flat magic penetration we get from sorcery shoes, we get 28 to 38 flat pen with this build. Now if you compare these numbers, we see that both builds are basically equal in terms of stats. The Nightharvester build basically gives you 50 more AP compared to the Rocketbelt build, but you also get a bit less flat magic penetration, specifically 6 to 16 less flat pen. Now does the 6 to 16 flat pen difference compensate the extra 50 AP? To be honest, it's hard to tell. It will depend on the game, but in general the difference is insignificant and that renders it useless to think about this. Because this small difference is not why we prefer one build over another. Now there are some differences we can make in the build pods of each build to create some clearer differences, and I will do that in a bit. But first, let's take a look at individual power spikes of each build. I will put the numbers on screen for those of you who are interested in that, but I'm mainly going to focus on the conclusions here. So right now you can have a look at all the numbers I analyzed for both the Nightharvester and the Rocketbelt build. Feel free to pause the video here if that's something you're interested in, but I'm going to move on to the conclusions. Alright, so basically I compared the first item power spike from the Nightharvester build with the first power spike from the Rocketbelt build. I did this for all the item power spikes, and now I'll tell you all the conclusions I came up with per item power spike comparison basically. Alright, let's start with the first item power spike. These two items are basically the same. They cost the same amount of gold and give you relatively equal stats. The only difference here is that Nightharvester gives you an extra 10 ability haste, whereas Rocketbelt gives you an extra 6 flat magic penetration. Is 10 ability haste better or worse than 6 flat magic pen? Once again, hard to tell. Also, even if it is, it's quite insignificant, so let's just say that the first item power spike is basically equally good on both builds. Here's a quick side note though, I do believe it's easier to get the extra damage from Nightharvester's Soul Rend compared to the Rocketbelt active, simply because of the fact that Rocketbelt active is a skill shot and you can miss it, so you could potentially miss out on some important damage. Also, build path wise, it could feel smoother to buy a Fiendish Codex compared to a Hextech Alternator, so one could argue that the 10 extra ability haste is quite important, but that depends on personal preference and playstyle. I personally do prefer the 10 ability haste over the 6 flat magic penetration. Now, the second power spike will tell us a lot more. This right here, the second item power spike, is the biggest difference between both builds. At 2 items, the Nightharvester gives you by far the best stats. The raw ability power increase you get from Deathcap completely outperforms the Rocketbelt and Cosmic Drive combo. Alright, let's take a look at the third item powerspike comparison. The biggest difference here between the two builds is that at this point the Nightharvester gets you percentage magic penetration, whereas Rocketbelt gives you flat magic penetration. If the enemy hasn't specifically bought magic resist, then the 16 flat penetration you get from Rocketbelt passive will basically have the same amount of value as Void Staff's percentage magic penetration, because both will do around 40% magic resist reduction, considering that the average level of magic resist without specifically buying magic resist would be something like 40 MR. But if the enemy team did buy magic resist, which is very likely at this point in the game, then the extra flat penetration from Void Staff will be a lot more valuable. Meaning the third item power spike between Nightharvester and Rocketbelt is equally strong unless the enemy buys magic resist, then the Nightharvester 3 item power spike is stronger. So basically there's no reason not to pick the Nightharvester build if you're looking for the best second and third item power spike. As for the fourth and fifth item power spike, the differences between both builds are actually quite insignificant. We don't need to take a look at the 6th item power spike as well, because we already compared both full builds with each other and they were basically the same. Now I did mention that we could make the differences between both builds a little bit bigger. So our main conclusion at this point should be that both builds are basically equal. In terms of stats at full build, it's basically the same, right? However, we can prefer the Nightharvester build if we want to spike earlier, and we can prefer the Rocketbelt build if we want the extra mobility from the Rocketbelt active. Now I did mention that we don't have to follow these most common build paths, and we're definitely not going to build Demonic's Embrace every single game. So we can just adjust the build paths from both builds just a bit to make the differences between them bigger and thus bring more value to choosing one build over another in certain situations. Let's take a look at the Rocketbelt build. Alright, so what could make a big difference is if you build Shadow Flame as a last item in the Rocketbelt build instead of Demonics. This would result in a little bit less total ability power, specifically 648 ability power compared to the previous number of 670 ability power. But it would also result in an extra 10 to 20 flat magic penetration from Shadow Flame, meaning that right now we would have 75 less ability power compared to the Nightharvester build, but we would also have an extra 26 flat magic penetration, which could be significant if the enemies are stacking a lot of magic resist, because flat magic pen is applied after percentage magic pen. And 26 extra flat pen is a lot more significant than the previous 6 to 16 extra flat pen. So we're basically making the build a bit less all round, but we're also creating a build that's turbo effective against magic resist stacking team comps. So now we did come up with a situation where it's clearly better to choose Rocketbelt over the Nightharvester build. Now I did mention in my previous guide that generally speaking the Nightharvester build is better against magic resist stacking comps, and I still stand by that. Why, could you ask? Well, it's basically because oftentimes you won't be able to go both Void and Shadow Flame in the same build when you go Rocketbelt, and even when you do, it takes a long time to benefit from it. Whereas if you go Nightharvester, you do almost always go Void and Shadow Flame in the same build and quite early on as well, so you can immediately abuse its strength against magic resist stacking comps. Especially considering the fact that you spike so early, and especially considering that you won't always go Cosmic Drive with the Rocketbelt either, so you will also miss out on some ability haste, which sucks if you're playing against tankier team comps. Now you could perfectly replace Cosmic Drive with a Horizon Focus in the Rocketbelt build and finish the build off with a Shadow Flame. This way you will have significantly more burst potential, but you will also lose about 15 ability haste, which is also quite significant. In the Nightharvester build we could also easily replace Demonics as a last item with something like a Zhonya's. This way we would get 15 ability haste more. But keep in mind, at this point if you were to compare both builds, there would actually be a 30 ability haste difference between both builds in favor of Nightharvester, but Rocketbelt might have more burst potential, so right now it does seem a lot more logical to prefer one build over another depending on the situation. Alright, that is basically everything I wanted to mention today. That's everything I wanted to talk about. We discussed every single thing. This should put an end to the Nightharvester versus Rocketbelt debate. Thank you guys so much for watching this video until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well if you're still here, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye.